The dust of Dry Creek never settled. It was a restless thing, a fine pale powder that clung to everything, the raw timber of the storefronts, the sweat on a man's brow, the memories best left buried. On this particular Tuesday, the dust was whipped into a frenzy by a wind that carried the first bitter promise of winter, scouring the main street with a sound like a drawn-out sigh. Inside the First Territorial Bank, the air was still and smelled of ink, old paper, and the false security of iron. Sawyer Reed stood at the teller's window, his broad shoulders filling the space, his gaze distant. He was a man carved from the high plains, all hard lines and quiet endurance. He had come to town for salt ammunition and a length of rope, but first he had to withdraw the modest funds he kept for such trips. The bank teller, a young man named Peterson, with a nervous tick in his left eye, counted out the coins with painstaking slowness. That was when the world broke open. The batwing doors of the bank slammed inward with a crack like a gunshot. 3 men spilled into the room, and their faces obscured by dusty bandanas, their movements practiced and predatory. The one in the lead was tall and moved with a chilling theatrical grace. He held 2 silver-plated revolvers, their pearl grips gleaming in the dim light. "Ladies and gentlemen," the leader's voice was a silken drawl, strangely articulate for a common thief, "we humbly request your undivided attention. A brief, and I do hope orderly transaction, is about to commence." Panic erupted. A woman shrieked. Peterson dropped his coin-scoop silver dollars, scattering across the floor like terrified beetles. The other 2 robbers moved with brutal efficiency, one vaulting over the counter to shove a canvas sack at the trembling teller, the other covering the half-dozen customers, his shotgun a blunt instrument of persuasion. Sawyer didn't move. He had seen violence before, had dealt it and received it, and his first instinct was always stillness. He watched, assessing his mind, a cold, clear mechanism. But the leader's eyes, dark and intelligent above the faded blue of his mask, found Sawyer's. The man took a deliberate step toward him, a slow, appraising circle like a wolf inspecting a sheep it found curiously out of place. "Well now," the man purred, his gaze lingering on the worn leather of Sawyer's gun belt. "You look like a man who understands the value of restraint." He gestured with the barrel of his revolver. "Your coin and any other trifles of value." Sawyer's hands went up slowly, a gesture of compliance. He placed the small stack of coins he'd just received onto the counter. He was not a man of trifles. He owned his horse, his rifle, his cabin, and the clothes on his back. Everything else was memory. As he moved, the chain of a small silver locket tucked deep inside his shirt caught a ray of dusty light. It was a subtle glint, almost imperceptible, but the robber's eyes snapped to it. With a flick of his wrist, he snagged the chain and ripped it from Sawyer's neck. The clasp bit into Sawyer's skin. The locket fell into the robber's gloved palm. Something inside Sawyer, a core of ice he'd carefully constructed over 5 long years, cracked. Every muscle in his body coiled his hand, hovering inches from the butt of his Colt. The leader saw the shift. He smiled, the expression a cruel curl of his lips visible beneath the mask. He clicked open the locket. Inside, the miniature, hand-tinted portrait of a woman with sad, knowing eyes stared out. Eleanor. A beautiful ghost. The robber mused, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper only Sawyer could hear. He snapped the locket shut, the click echoing the sound of a closing casket. But a man shouldn't cling to ghosts, Mr. Reed. They have a way of dragging you down into the dirt with them. The use of his name struck Sawyer with the force of a physical blow. A cold dread, colder than any Wyoming winter, seeped into his bones. How did this man know his name? How did he know about ghosts? Before Sawyer could process the shock, the robbery was over. The canvas sack was full. The leader pocketed the locket and backed toward the door, his revolver still trained on the room. "A pleasure doing business with the fine people of Dry Creek," he said with a mocking bow. Then they were gone, swallowed by the wind and the dust, leaving behind a shattered silence and a handful of terrified citizens. Sawyer stood frozen, his hand pressed to his chest where the locket used to be. The raw, empty space felt like a fresh wound. It wasn't the silver he mourned. It was the last tangible piece of a life that had been burned to ash. The portrait was all he had left of her face, the only proof she had ever been real. And a stranger, a ghost himself, had taken it, leaving behind a poison-tipped question that now burrowed deep into Sawyer's soul. The High Plains were a kingdom of silence. Sawyer's homestead was a lonely outpost in its heart, a small cabin of hand-hewn logs, chinked with mud, and stubborn will crouched against the vast, unblinking eye of the Wyoming sky. For 5 years this silence had been his penance and his shield. It was a heavy blanket that muffled the echoes of a gunshot and the memory of a woman's laugh and the weight of a life he had purposefully discarded. He'd built the cabin himself, his hands raw and bleeding, working from dawn until the last bruised light faded from the sky. Every notched log, every hammered peg was an act of forgetting. Here he was not the man he had been. He was just Sawyer Reed, a homesteader, a man who spoke to his horse more than to other people, whose days were measured by the rising of the sun and the needs of the land. His grief was a quiet, orderly thing now. It lived in the worn armchair by the hearth where she would have sat. It was in the extra space in his bed, a cold geography he never crossed. And it was in the silver locket which he would take out each night, the cool metal a familiar weight in his calloused palm. He would study Eleanor's face, tracing the delicate line of her jaw, trying to recall the exact shade of her eyes, a detail that was beginning to fade like an old photograph left in the sun. The locket was his anchor, the one thing that proved the man he used to be. The man who could love, who could be loved, had existed at all. Now it was gone, stolen by a man who knew his name, a man who spoke of ghosts. The cryptic remark haunted him, replaying in his mind, until the words lost all meaning and became a dull, throbbing ache. He sat by his cold hearth, the cabin darker than usual, the silence no longer a comfort but an accusation. Days later, the need for supplies finally drove him back down the winding trail to Dry Creek. The town was still buzzing with talk of the robbery. Sheriff Dobson, a man whose weary posture suggested he'd seen too much of human nature to be surprised by any of it, was questioning a freight driver outside the marshal's office. Sawyer rode past without a word, and the emptiness on his chest a constant galling reminder of his loss. He tied his horse Blue to the hitching post outside the general store, his movements stiff. A sharp scent of yeast and baking bread, a smell of simple, honest sustenance cut through the dusty air. It drew him toward the bakery 2 doors down, a small island of warmth in the encroaching cold. As he reached for the door, a movement beside the refuse barrel caught his eye. A woman was kneeling in the churned mud and snow. Her dress, once of fine southern cotton by the look of the tattered lace at its cuffs, was now little more than a collection of rags clinging to a frame made sharp by hunger. Her hands were bare-chapped red and blue by the cold. With trembling fingers, she fished a discarded half-roll from the barrel, its crust smeared with ash. She brought it to her lips with a desperate reverence, as if it were a sacrament. The bakery door flew open. "Get away from there." The baker's wife, a woman built like one of her own ovens, stood framed in the doorway, brandishing a broom. "Go on, girl, begging in the dirt like some strayed dog. Filthy runaway." The young woman flinched, stumbling back as crumbs fell from her lips. She didn't speak, just wrapped her arms around herself, a small, futile defense against the woman's scorn and the wind's bite. I said go, the baker's wife repeated, swatting the air near the girl's head. You've got a nerve coming back here with that bounty on your head. Sawyer stepped forward, his tall frame instinctively blocking the wind shielding the girl. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, settled on her face. It was a face of stark contrasts, fine, delicate bones beneath skin stretched taut with exhaustion and want, and wide, haunted eyes that held a flicker of defiant pride. He saw not a thief, but a survivor cornered by the world. Without a word, he turned and stepped inside the bakery, the bell above the door jangling a meek protest. The interior was a thick, sweet haze of warmth and flour. A fresh loaf, he said, his voice a low rumble. The baker's wife huffed, her indignation warring with the prospect of a sale. She snatched a loaf from the cooling rack, wrapped it in brown paper, and thrust it at him. Sawyer paid his gaze, never leaving her a silent condemnation that made her drop her eyes. He walked straight back out into the cold and crouched before the young woman. He held out the bread. She stared first at the loaf, then at him, snowflakes melting on her long lashes. Her expression was a fragile mix of suspicion and disbelief. A lady shouldn't have to beg for bread, he said, the words simple, the meaning absolute. For a long moment, she didn't move. Then slowly, as if waking from a long and terrible dream, she reached out. Her fingers brushed his as she took the loaf, and a small broken sound escaped her throat, a sound of relief so profound it was almost pain. She bit into the bread, her eyes closing, her whole body seeming to soften with the first taste of nourishment. The baker's wife, still hovering in the doorway, scoffed loudly. She's the one ran off from that Avril wedding. Stole her groom's family jewels, they say. Threw away a fortune. For what, to wander in the snow like a lost lamb? The girl froze mid-bite, the bread clutched in her hands. The flicker of life in her eyes dimmed. Sawyer looked at her, then back at the baker's wife. That her business or yours? He asked, his voice flat and cold as riverstone. The baker's wife sputtered, taken aback. The girl, however, answered for herself, her voice a soft, cultured whisper that seemed out of place in the muddy street. My name is Margot Claire. I was to marry a man named Lucas Avril. I ran. That is the truth of it. Sawyer studied her face, seeing the truth she spoke, and the deeper one she didn't. He gave a single curt nod, satisfied. He had no interest in rumors, only in the evidence of his own eyes. And his eyes saw a woman drowning. The decision was not a conscious thought. It was an impulse, a pull toward something other than the crushing gravity of his own past. He saw in her a loneliness that mirrored his own, a different kind of exile. To leave her here to be devoured by the town's judgment in the coming winter felt like a betrayal of some unspoken law of the wild, that you didn't leave a wounded thing to die. He finished his shopping, his mind working quietly, methodically. He bought more than he needed: extra flour, salted pork, coffee, and a small tin of salve for her chapped hands. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the bruised sky in shades of orange and violet when he found her again. She was huddled in the narrow alley beside the saloon, a sliver of space that smelled of sour whiskey and regret trying to draw warmth from the thin blanket of his scarf. You have somewhere warm to sleep tonight? He asked, his voice cutting through the rising wind. She shook her head, not looking at him. The stable hand? He lets me stay near the stables if I keep quiet. The image of her sleeping in the freezing straw was enough. The words came before he could stop them. My place is quiet. Plenty of room. No one there but me and the land. She looked up, then her eyes wide with a caution that tore at him. You're not worried about what people will say, about the bounty? I stopped caring about people's talk a long time ago, he said, the statement a flat, hard truth. He held out his hand. It was a simple offer, a bridge across the chasm of their separate solitudes. You can stay through the winter, help with the chores. Come spring, you can go wherever you please. Margot looked at his outstretched hand. It was large, calloused, etched with the story of hard labor and a life lived outdoors. It was a hand that could build a house or break a man. But in that moment it was steady. It was safe. For a woman who had known nothing but shifting ground for months, it was everything. She hesitated for only a heartbeat longer, then placed her small, cold hand in his. The contact was brief, but it was a pact. A silent agreement to face the coming darkness together. They rode out of Dry Creek under the cover of a twilight that deepened the snow to a soft, ethereal blue. They didn't look back. Ahead of them lay the high plains, a vast, white wilderness that promised nothing but survival. For Sawyer, he was bringing a stranger into the sanctuary of his grief. For Margot, she was riding toward a future she couldn't yet imagine with a man who had offered her bread and then, inexplicably, a home. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was filled with the unspoken weight of a choice that had just changed both their lives forever. The first week at the homestead was a delicate dance of distance. The cabin, which had always felt just big enough for one man and his ghosts, now seemed crowded with a new living presence. Sawyer was acutely aware of her every movement, the soft rustle of her mended dress, the quiet way she washed the dishes, the faint scent of lavender soap that now clung to the rough-hewn air. He gave her the small loft space, a cozy nook under the eaves he had previously used for storage. From below, he could sometimes hear the soft creak of the floorboards as she turned in her sleep. He was a man accustomed to solitude, and the intrusion should have felt jarring. Instead, it was grounding. Her presence was a quiet anchor in the vast drifting sea of his days. He found himself mending the leak in the roof he'd ignored for months, sweeping the hearth more thoroughly, ensuring the woodpile was always stacked high. These were not acts of courtship. They were the practical expressions of a responsibility he had unknowingly assumed. One afternoon, a bitter wind rattled the shutters and drove snow against the window panes. A rider appeared on the ridge, a dark silhouette against the stark white landscape. Sawyer's hand went instinctively to the pistol tucked in his waistband. He motioned for Margot to stay inside out of sight and stepped onto the porch, his rifle held loosely at his side. The man who dismounted was lean and weathered his face a roadmap of hard miles. He wore a long duster coat, and a rifle was slung across his back. His eyes, small and sharp as a hawk's, scanned the homestead with a practiced assessing gaze. "You Sawyer Reed?" the man asked, his voice flat, devoid of warmth. Sawyer nodded once. "Who's asking?" The man reached inside his coat, his movements slow and deliberate, and produced a folded piece of paper. "Name's Ethan Cole. I'm a bounty hunter, here on lawful business." He handed the paper to Sawyer. It was a wanted poster, the ink slightly smeared from the damp. But the words were clear, a stark and brutal summary of Margot's alleged crimes. Wanted Margot Clare. Theft of dowry goods, including the Averill family emeralds. Absconding from a legal engagement. Reward $2,000, authorized by Lucas Averill. Sawyer's face remained a stony mask, but inside a cold anger began to smolder. $2,000. A fortune. Enough to make a man hunt a half-starved girl to the ends of the earth. He folded the paper slowly, his thumb pressing down on the crease. "She's not here," he said, his voice level. Cole's eyebrow twitched. "You certain about that? Folks in town said she was seen with you, riding north." "She was," Sawyer replied, meeting the bounty hunter's gaze without blinking. "Came through here weeks ago. Sick and half-starved. I gave her food and a fire for a few nights. She left 2 mornings back. Headed for the territories, I reckon." It was a lie smooth and practice born of an instinct to protect that surprised even him. Cole's eyes narrowed. "And you just let a wanted fugitive walk away." "I let a girl walk," Sawyer corrected him, his voice hardening slightly. "If she was anything else, I didn't see it." The bounty hunter's gaze shifted, moving past Sawyer to the cabin door, lingering on the single window where a faint light glowed. "Mind if I take a look inside, just to satisfy my curiosity?" Sawyer didn't move. He subtly shifted his weight, his hand now resting on the stock of his rifle. "I do mind," he said. The words were quiet, but they carried the unmistakable weight of a line being drawn. The air between them grew thick and heavy, stretched thin with tension. Cole was a man who made his living through intimidation and violence. Sawyer was a man who had left that world behind, but had not forgotten its language. For a long, silent moment, they measured each other. Cole's hand twitched near the pistol on his hip, his gaze calculating the odds. He saw the set of Sawyer's jaw, the lack of fear in his eyes, and apparently he decided the reward wasn't worth the risk. Not yet. He clicked his tongue and swung himself back into the saddle. "If she comes back," Cole said, his voice laced with a veiled threat, "and you're found to be harboring her, you'll answer for it. You understand that, Reed?" Sawyer gave a single sharp nod. "I understand more than you think." Cole gave him one last, lingering look. There was something in it beyond professional interest, a flicker of recognition perhaps, or simple curiosity. "Strange," the bounty hunter muttered more to himself than to Sawyer. "For a simple homesteader, you carry yourself like a man who expects trouble." With that, he spurred his horse and rode away, disappearing back into the swirling snow. Sawyer watched until he was nothing more than a speck, his body rigid. He had just lied to a lawman, obstructed justice, and placed himself squarely between Margot and the wrath of a powerful, wealthy family. He had stepped off his lonely, self-contained island and into a current that was pulling him somewhere new and dangerous. He walked back inside the cabin, the cold clinging to him, and saw Margot standing in the shadows, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. And something else, a fragile, burgeoning trust. He had chosen. The consequences would come when they came. In the weeks that followed Ethan Cole's visit, the cabin became a world unto itself, sealed off from the judgment of Dry Creek by a fortress of snow and shared purpose. The threat of the bounty hunter, a shadow lingering on the horizon, had forged a new kind of intimacy between them. Not one of romance, but of alliance. They were partners in a quiet rebellion against the world that had cast them both out. Sawyer began to teach her the art of survival as he knew it. His lessons were practical, delivered with few words. He showed her how to track a rabbit in the snow, how to read the clouds for a coming storm, how to split wood with a clean, efficient swing of the axe. He placed a rifle in her arms, its weight unfamiliar and menacing. "I have never held a firearm," she said, her voice a near whisper. "Time you learned," he replied, his tone even. He stood behind her, his presence a steady warmth against her back, guiding her hands, adjusting her stance. "You're not aiming to kill?" He explained, his voice low by her ear. "You're aiming to live. There's a difference." When she finally hit the tin can he'd set on a fence post, a small, triumphant sound escaped her lips. A genuine smile, the first he'd ever seen from her, lit up her face, chasing away the shadows for a moment. It struck Sawyer with an unexpected force, a glimpse of the woman she might have been, the woman she could still become. In return, Margot brought a different kind of life back into the cabin. She repaired the worn-out curtains with neat, almost invisible stitches. She found a patch of winter herbs near a sheltered creek bed and made a tea that soothed the ache in Sawyer's joints. One evening, humming a soft, sad tune from her childhood, she found his tattered copy of Shakespeare and began to read aloud. Her voice, cultured and clear, filled the small space, weaving stories of kings and star-crossed lovers into the firelit darkness. Sawyer would sit in his chair pretending to mend a piece of tack, but he was listening to every word, feeling dormant parts of his own soul stir to life. Slowly, they began to share pieces of their pasts. She told him of her life in Georgia, of a sprawling house with white columns and the scent of magnolias, a world of genteel manners that concealed a rot of pride and desperation. He in turn offered fragments of his own story. He spoke of growing up in Texas, of learning to handle a horse before he could properly read, of a restless spirit that had always pulled him west. But he never spoke of Eleanor. He never spoke of the duel. That part of his life was a locked room, and he had long ago thrown away the key. His investigation into her bounty was a quiet, relentless pursuit. Whenever he rode to town for supplies, he'd spend time at the telegraph office sending discreet inquiries to a former acquaintance, a retired lawman now living in Cheyenne. He had Margot write down every detail she could remember about Lucas Averill and the so-called stolen jewels. The bounty notice itself felt wrong. It was too public, too loud for a simple matter of a broken engagement and a family heirloom. A man like Averill, a railroad heir with a reputation to protect, would typically handle such an embarrassment quietly. This felt like a performance, a spectacle designed to attract attention. One evening, a reply came from Cheyenne. The telegram was terse. Averill family has no official record of stolen emeralds. No reports filed with local authorities in Georgia. The bounty was posted privately through a Pinkerton agent named Silas Kane. Name sound familiar. Proceed with caution. Silas Kane. The name struck Sawyer like a phantom limb, an ache from a wound he thought had long since scarred over. He stood in the cold, dusty telegraph office, the flimsy paper trembling in his hand. Fragments of memory, sharp and jagged, flashed through his mind. The flash of a pistol in the dawn light. The smell of gun smoke and damp earth. The face of a young man, contorted in anger and grief, screaming a name. His brother's name. James. James Kane. He stumbled out into the street, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. It couldn't be. It was a coincidence, a trick of a mind haunted by the past. But the pieces began to click into place with a sickening, inexorable logic. The bounty hunter Ethan Cole and his strange, knowing look. The bank robber who knew Sawyer's name, who had taken Eleanor's locket. The cryptic warning about clinging to ghosts. The robber's voice, that silky, articulate drawl, it was the same voice as the young man who had sworn revenge over his brother's body all those years ago, Silas Kane. The revelation descended upon Sawyer not like a lightning strike, but like a slow, creeping frost, chilling him to the bone. He sat alone in the barn, the scent of hay and horses, a familiar comfort that did nothing to soothe the turmoil inside him. Margot was not the target. She had never been the target. She was the bait. Every detail, every event of the past few months was cast in a new, sinister light. Silas Kane, the younger brother of the man Sawyer had killed in a duel 5 years ago, had constructed this entire, elaborate charade. He had found a desperate, vulnerable woman, Margot, and had woven a fiction around her, creating a bounty so large and so public that it would draw out every bounty hunter and fortune seeker in the territory. But its true purpose was to create noise to flush Sawyer out of his self-imposed exile. The bank robbery now made a terrible kind of sense. It wasn't about the money. It was a message. Silas had taken the locket, Eleanor's locket, to signal that he knew everything. He knew Sawyer's history, his weaknesses, the precise location of his deepest wounds. A man shouldn't cling to ghosts. It wasn't a random piece of philosophy. It was a direct, personal threat. Silas wasn't just coming for Sawyer's life. He was coming for his soul. He meant to dismantle Sawyer's past, to poison his memories, and to destroy the quiet peace he had so painstakingly built. A wave of guilt, sharp and suffocating, washed over him. He had brought this danger to Margot. He had pulled her into the undertow of his own violent past, offering her sanctuary, while unknowingly leading her deeper into the jaws of a trap set for him. He walked back to the cabin, his steps heavy. Margot was by the fire, mending one of his shirts, the flickering light catching the gold in her hair. She looked up as he entered, her expression open and trusting. The sight of it was like a knife in his gut. "Margot," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "We need to talk." He laid it all out for her. The duel, the man he had killed, James Kane, the younger brother Silas, who had sworn revenge. He explained his suspicion that her bounty was a lie, a fabrication designed to make him visible, to make him vulnerable. She listened without interruption, her hands still in her lap, the needle and thread forgotten. Her face grew pale, but there was no accusation in her eyes, only a dawning understanding and a quiet, resolute strength that continued to surprise him. "So," she said softly when he had finished this, "Mr. Kane, he used my story to create a trap for you." Sawyer nodded, unable to meet her gaze. "He did. And I walked us both right into it. You should have been gone from here long ago. I should have sent you away." "And where would I have gone, Sawyer?" she asked, her voice gentle but firm. "Back to the alley in Dry Creek. Back to begging for scraps. You gave me a home when I had none. You taught me how to be strong. Whatever this is, it is not your fault. It is his." She stood and came to him, placing a hand on his arm. "This is our fight now, not just yours." Her loyalty, so freely given when he felt he deserved it, least was both a comfort and a burden. He looked at her, then truly looked at her, and saw not the frightened runaway he had first met, but a woman of immense courage. A woman who had faced down her own demons and was now willing to face his. In that moment, he knew he was no longer fighting to protect a memory. He was fighting to protect a future he had not dared to imagine until she had walked into his life. The trap was set, but now at least he would not face it alone. The first sign of Silas Kane's arrival was not a rider on the horizon, but a shift in the very atmosphere of Dry Creek. A palpable tension coiled through the town, as thick and suffocating as the dust kicked up by the hot, dry winds of a false spring. Sawyer felt it the moment he rode in for supplies. The usual hum of activity was replaced by a watchful quiet. People spoke in hushed tones, their eyes darting nervously toward the saloon. Sheriff Dobson stood on the boardwalk outside his office, chewing on an unlit cigar, his face etched with a deeper-than-usual weariness. "He's here, isn't he?" Sawyer asked, dismounting beside him. There was no need to say the name. The sheriff spat onto the dusty street. "Rode in this morning with a half-dozen men, all of them armed to the teeth and carrying the same dead-eyed look. Calls himself Kane. Took over the saloon. Paid the owner in gold to clear the place out. He's just waiting." "He's not here for the town," Sawyer said, his voice low. "He's here for me." "I figured as much," Dobson sighed. "He's been asking questions about you, and about the Claire girl, spreading that bounty notice around like he's selling salvation." The sheriff looked at Sawyer, his expression grim. "This is more than a bounty hunt, Reed. This man is a predator. Whatever business you have with him, I suggest you settle it fast or get the hell out of my town." But Sawyer knew running was no longer an option. Silas wouldn't just let him go. He would hunt him, and he would use anyone and anything Sawyer cared about to draw him out. He had to face him. He was turning to leave when a commotion erupted from further down the street. A young girl, no older than 10, came running from the direction of the apothecary, her face streaked with tears. It was Clara, Mrs. Delaney's daughter. "He took her," the girl cried, stumbling into the sheriff's arms. "He took Mama." Sawyer's blood ran cold. He and the sheriff ran toward the apothecary. The door was ajar, a bottle of tonic shattered on the floor. It was empty. A grizzled old-timer, a prospector named Elias Jones, who was often seen panning for flecks of gold in the creek, stood nearby, his eyes wide. "Saw it myself," Elias rasped, pointing a shaky finger toward the saloon. "That fancy fella Kane. He and his men just walked right in and dragged Mrs. Delaney and the little one out. Said something about needing insurance." The trap had been sprung. Silas had grown impatient. He wasn't just going to wait for Sawyer to come to him, he was going to force his hand. He had taken 2 of the town's most beloved and defenseless citizens hostage, a widowed mother and her child. He was turning Sawyer's personal battle into a public crisis, forcing him to act not just for himself or for Margot, but for the entire community. The townspeople began to gather their faces, a mixture of fear and outrage. They looked from the saloon now, a silent, menacing fortress, to Sawyer. He was the eye of this storm. He was the reason this darkness had fallen upon their town. Sawyer met Sheriff Dobson's gaze. "Get these people to safety," he said, his voice calm, resolute. "Keep them back. This is between me and him." "This is my town," Reed Dobson countered, his hand resting on his gun. "And they are my ghosts," Sawyer replied the words, tasting like ash. He turned and began the long, lonely walk toward the saloon. The batwing doors waited like the gates of hell. Behind them, his past in the form of Silas Kane was waiting to collect its due. And the price, he knew, would be paid in blood. The sky had turned a strange, sickly yellow, the color of old bruises. The wind, which had been a restless whisper all day, now began to howl, flinging sand and grit against the buildings with a furious, abrasive hiss. A sandstorm was brewing nature's fury, mirroring the storm about to break within the walls of the Dry Creek Saloon. Sawyer pushed through the batwing doors. The saloon was unnaturally quiet. The air was thick with the smell of stale whiskey fear and Silas Kane's expensive cologne. Silas stood behind the bar, casually polishing a glass, a picture of relaxed, predatory grace. His men were positioned around the room shadows with rifles. In a corner, tied to chairs but otherwise unharmed, sat Mrs. Delaney and her young daughter Clara. The widow's face was pale but defiant. The girl's was buried in her mother's side. Silas looked up as Sawyer entered, a slow, triumphant smile spreading across his handsome face. He was younger than Sawyer remembered, but his eyes held an ancient, chilling hatred. "Sawyer Reed." Silas said, his voice the same silken drawl from the bank. Punctual as always. "I was beginning to think you'd lost your nerve. Please come in. The party is just beginning." "Let them go," Kane Sawyer said, his voice a low growl. He kept his hands in plain sight away from his gun. "Your fight is with me." "Oh, everything in due time," Silas replied, setting the glass down with a delicate click. He walked out from behind the bar, circling Sawyer as he had in the bank. "You see, I've waited 5 years for this moment. I've imagined it 1,000 times. A simple bullet would be too kind, too quick. I want you to understand the depth of your crime. I want you to feel what I felt when you murdered my brother." The wind shrieked outside, rattling the windows in their frames. Dust began to seep through the cracks in the walls, creating hazy dancing columns in the dim light. "It was a fair duel," Silas Sawyer said, his voice tight. "Your brother instigated it." "A duel?" Silas laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. "You call that a duel? James was a boy full of foolish pride and whiskey. You were a seasoned gunfighter, a man with a reputation. You executed him." He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "And for what? For a woman who was playing you both like a fiddle." Sawyer stiffened. "Leave her out of this." "Oh, I can't." Silas purred, his eyes gleaming with malice. "Because she is the whole point. Dear sainted Eleanor, the ghost you cling to so desperately." He reached into his coat and tossed the silver locket onto the floor between them. It spun on the dusty floorboards, a glint of tarnished silver. "You see," Silas continued, his voice rising with theatrical fervor, "I read her diaries after she passed. Found them tucked away. And what a fascinating story they told. She wrote about you, the stoic, honorable Sawyer Reed, a man she could mold into her protector. And she wrote about my brother, the passionate, wealthy James Kane, a man she could use for his fortune. She told you James was forcing his affections on her. She told James you were a jealous brute who wouldn't leave her be. She pitted you against each other, two bulls in a ring, all for her own amusement and gain. The words were poison darts, each one finding its mark in the deepest, most sacred parts of Sawyer's memory. It couldn't be true. Eleanor, his Eleanor, was gentle kind, a victim of James Kane's unwanted advances. That was the story he had built his entire exile upon, the guilt that had driven him into the wilderness. She was a master manipulator, Reed Silas hissed, seeing the doubt on Sawyer's face. She loved the drama. She orchestrated that entire duel, hoping you would wound James, teach him a lesson, and bind yourself to her forever through your guilt. She never imagined you would actually kill him. It spoiled her little game. A side door creaked open. Margot stood there, her face a pale oval in the gloom, a rifle held steady in her hands. She had followed him. Silas's eyes flickered toward her, a spark of cruel inspiration lighting them. Ah, the replacement. How fitting. Another damsel in distress for the noble Sawyer Reed to rescue. Does she know she is merely a stand-in for a ghost? A ghost who was never what you thought she was. He turned his attention back to Sawyer, his final devastating blow ready. The day of the duel, she sent a note to James. "I found it. It said, 'He is a man of honor. He will not draw first. Provoke him, my love, and this will all be over.'" She sent him to his death, Sawyer. You were just the weapon she chose to use. The world tilted on its axis. The foundation of Sawyer's grief, his guilt, his 5 years of penance, it all crumbled to dust. The sandstorm outside reached its peak, screaming like a banshee as the storm inside Sawyer finally broke. He was not a grieving widower. He was a fool. A pawn. With a roar of pure animalistic rage, he drew his gun. But Silas was ready. He grabbed Clara, pulling the child in front of him as a shield. Justice, Reed Silas yelled over the wind. Or vengeance. What kind of man are you now? Sawyer froze his gun, aimed his finger on the trigger. He looked at Silas's snarling face, at the terrified child, at Mrs. Delaney's horrified gasp, and at Margot, her eyes pleading with him. The image of Eleanor, pure and perfect, shattered in his mind, replaced by a devastating truth. To kill Silas now in a fit of rage would be to become the monster Silas believed him to be. It would be an act of vengeance, not justice. It would validate the lie he had lived for 5 long years. With a shuddering breath that felt like it was tearing him apart from the inside, Sawyer lowered his gun. "It's over, Silas," he said, his voice hollow. In that moment of hesitation, Sheriff Dobson and 2 deputies burst in through the back, guns raised. Seeing he was outmaneuvered, Silas shoved the child away and made a desperate dive for his own weapon. But it was too late. Sawyer moved not with a gunman's speed, but with the raw force of a man unburdened. He slammed into Silas, driving him into the bar. The fight was short, brutal, and devoid of honor. It ended with Sawyer's hands around Silas's throat, the choice between life and death pulsing in his fingertips. He looked into the eyes of the man who had destroyed his past and saw only a pathetic, broken reflection of his own old hatred. He released him, shoving him into the waiting arms of the law. As the sheriff clapped irons on Silas's wrists, Sawyer sank to his knees, the weight of two truths, the one he'd just lost and the one he'd just found, crushing him. The storm outside began to subside, its fury spent. The saloon was quiet save for the sound of a child's muffled sobs and the ragged, painful sound of Sawyer Reed's breathing. In the aftermath of the sandstorm, a strange crystalline quiet settled over Dry Creek. The air was washed clean, and the sun broke through the clouds, casting long, forgiving shadows across the street. Sheriff Dobson led a defeated Silas Kane and his men to the town's small jail, their swagger gone, replaced by the grim reality of iron bars. The townspeople emerged slowly from their homes and shops, their faces etched with relief and a newfound respect. They gathered around Mrs. Delaney and Clara, wrapping them in blankets and quiet assurances. Sawyer remained in the saloon, sitting at a table staring at the tarnished silver locket on the dusty floor. Margot came to him, her steps soft. She picked up the locket and placed it gently in his hand, then sat opposite him. She didn't speak, simply waited, granting him the dignity of his silence. The weight of Silas's revelations was a physical burden pressing down on his shoulders. The woman he had mourned, the perfect memory he had enshrined, was a fiction. His guilt, the engine of his 5-year penance, was built on a lie. He felt hollowed out, a man unmoored from his own history. All those years, he said finally, his voice raspy, unfamiliar to his own ears. I built my life around a ghost. And the ghost was a lie. He looked up at Margot, his eyes raw with a pain that was deeper than grief. The man I killed. I might have done it for nothing. You did it because you believed you were protecting someone? Margot said, her voice a soft, steady anchor in his swirling confusion. Your reasons were true, Sawyer, even if her heart was not. The honor was yours, not hers. He looked at his hands, calloused and strong. They had taken a life based on a falsehood. But they had also built a home, offered shelter, protected the innocent. Who was he then? Not the grieving widower. Not the vengeful gunfighter. I don't know who I am without that story, he whispered. Then perhaps, she replied, reaching across the table to cover his hand with her own. It is time to start a new one. One that you write for yourself. Their conversation was interrupted by Sheriff Dobson. He cleared his throat, holding his hat in his hands. Reed, the whole town, we owe you. You faced him down. You chose right. He looked from Sawyer to Margot, a flicker of understanding in his weary eyes. Silas Kane is being held for the circuit judge. Kidnapping, attempted murder. He won't see the light of day for a long, long time. As for this bounty, he pulled a piece of paper from his pocket at the warrant for Margot's arrest. He tore it in half, then in half again, and let the pieces flutter to the floor. Far as I'm concerned, this matter is closed. Margot Clare is a citizen of Dry Creek, and she is under this town's protection. Later that evening, as they rode back to the homestead under a sky littered with stars, Sawyer was quiet. The emptiness inside him was still there, but it no longer felt like a void. It felt like open space, a clearing where something new might have room to grow. He had lost a past he never truly had, but for the first time in years, he felt the possibility of a future. Weeks turned into a month. The raw wound of the past began to scar over, not disappearing, but fading into the texture of a new life. The people of Dry Creek having witnessed Sawyer's courage and Margot's quiet strength, no longer looked at them with suspicion. Instead, there were nods of greeting, offers of help, and a simple, profound acceptance. Mrs. Delaney insisted on giving them a lifetime supply of her herbal remedies, and even the stern baker's wife left a warm apple pie on their wagon one day, a silent apology and a token of peace. One sun-drenched afternoon, the mail rider brought a letter from Cheyenne. It was addressed to Miss Margot Clare. Her hands trembled as she broke the seal. It was from the office of the circuit judge. Reverend Calhoun, a man whose faith in humanity had never wavered, had sent his written testimony along with sworn affidavits from Mrs. Delaney and a half-dozen other townspeople who remembered Margot's quiet acts of kindness from her first desperate days in Dry Creek. The letter was formal and brief. It stated that in light of new evidence and the confession of Silas Kane regarding his fraudulent bounty, all charges against her were officially dropped. Her name was cleared. She was in the eyes of the law and the world a free woman. Margot read the words aloud to Sawyer as they stood on the porch, the letters shaking in her hand. When she finished, a single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. It was not a tear of sorrow, but of release. The weight she had carried for so long, the constant fear of being hunted, simply dissolved into the warm afternoon air. That evening, Sawyer walked alone to the small blooming hawthorn tree at the edge of his property. The sun was setting bleeding crimson and gold across the horizon. He held the silver locket in his palm. He opened it one last time and looked at the portrait of Eleanor. He saw her now not as the saint he had created, but as a sad, flawed woman trapped by her own deceptions. He felt a pang not of love, but of pity. He closed the locket and the click soft and final. He dug a small hole in the rich earth at the base of the tree and buried it, covering it with soil and a smooth gray stone. He was not burying Eleanor. He was burying the ghost that had haunted him. He returned to the cabin where Margot was waiting, a quiet question in her eyes. He didn't say a word. Instead, he took her hand and led her back to the hawthorn tree. The first stars were appearing in the twilight sky. From his pocket, he produced a small, simple ring he had spent the last week carving from a piece of fallen aspen wood. It was smooth and pale, its surface imperfect, showing the grain of the wood, the marks of his knife. It was not silver or gold. It was not a symbol of wealth or status. It was a symbol of something far more real. A love built not on idealized memories, but on shared survival, on honesty, and on the hard, beautiful truth of a future they would build together. He slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. She looked from the ring to his face, her eyes shining in the fading light. "I have lived with silence for so long," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "And now with you, it is still quiet. But it feels alive." She leaned her head against his shoulder as they stood together, looking out at the vast, darkening land. They were no longer running from the past, no longer haunted by ghosts. They were simply two people standing on a small piece of earth under an endless sky at the beginning of a new story.